The F-5A Freedom Fighter is one of the rewards from the Export Order Summer 2021 event in War Thunder. Let's take a look. The Northrop F-5 is actually a pretty large family of aircraft. The original F-5 was developed independently by the Northrop Company rather than as a response to any particular military program, and it ended up being quite successful. Over the years, they produced thousands of these things in over a dozen versions, and it served with about 20 different air forces throughout the Cold War. The original design program went through some changes over the first couple of years as they figured out who exactly they wanted to sell this thing to. The first prototype was actually of the two-seat trainer version and flew in 1959, entering service in 1962. During the early 1960s, the US government wanted to produce a cheap, lightweight, basic fighter primarily as an export product to allies of the United States, and the F-5 was chosen to fill this role. There were a lot of versions of the F-5, and they're generally separated into two generations. The early models and the late models beginning with the F-5E onwards. What we're looking at here is the F-5A, the first production version, which is the event reward from the 2021 Export Order event. This plane is in the American tech tree and is different from the F-5A in the Chinese tech tree. The F-5A is at BR 10.3 and sits in rank 6. One of the first things you'll notice is that it doesn't have a radar set. Not even a ranging radar gun sight. In real life, the initial series F-5As didn't have a radar either, but many F-5As were upgraded with a basic radar set over time. And it would be nice if this was a researchable upgrade in the game, the same way that, some aircraft have to research the countermeasures of the radar warning receiver or something, but no such luck, no radar at all. The F-5A also doesn't have a ballistics computer, which might be a surprise considering its air-to-ground weapons, which we'll get to in a minute, but basically you're just firing blind with all of your weapons, so get some practice. The loadouts you have to choose from are pretty generous. You can take bombs, rockets, air-to-ground missiles, and tip-winders in almost every combination possible. With all of these air-to-ground weapons, the F-5A ends up being well-suited as a multi-role aircraft and can credibly perform close air support and ground RB. But, without the ballistics computer, air-to-ground missiles might be your best bet unless you're really good with inaccurate rockets and blind bombing. The air-to-ground missile you get is the familiar AGM-12B Bullpup, which is a manually guided missile. Some people are good with them, but I'm not. So in practice, I end up using them basically like rockets that actually fly straight. For air-to-air weapons, you get the familiar AIM-9B, which is the basic caged seeker entry-level heat seeker, and you also get the AIM-9E. In my opinion, the AIM-9E is, very bluntly, a bad weapon. It's basically an AIM-9B with an uncaged seeker and slightly better speed. That might sound good, but it still has a 10G maneuvering limit, very short range, and because it has an uncaged seeker, it's easy to lock up targets that you can't actually hit, and you're going to be very tempted to make shots that are going to miss. What I'm getting at is, if you're used to basically any other uncaged seeker IR missile, you're going to find the AIM-9E to be very difficult to use. And you'll be tempted to take shots that you might hit with if it was some other missile, but the AIM-9E just can't handle. You'll notice in most of the footage that I'm very picky about my missile shots, and you're probably wondering in some cases why I'm sitting there instead of shooting. Or at least, I was picky once I figured out the secret. Think of the AIM-9E as an AIM-9B that's a little easier to lock on with. Don't fire unless you think an AIM-9B could hit with the shot. If you follow that rule, you'll have much better luck with it. The flight performance of the F-5A is also a little bit lacking. Since you have a whole bunch of loadouts, you might get tempted to take this into Air RB, loaded up with air-to-ground weapons. The problem is, the F-5A doesn't have the performance to credibly do multi-role mission profiles in air battles. You don't have the top-end speed or the acceleration, and you won't get to the ground targets before you meet the enemy team. And as long as you have a few thousand pounds of dead weight hanging off the bottom of your plane, you lose your only real advantage in combat, your maneuverability. So you have to dump your ordnance if you get intercepted, which will happen more often than not since you start on the runway and you're not too fast. Now, I don't mean to pile on with this point or sound whiny or anything, but it's really important to be clear about this because a lot of people are going to be potentially getting this plane as their reward from the summer event here. The F-5A is underpowered for BR 10.3. Even in a clean configuration, with nothing but the tip winders, you can barely break Mach 1 at lower levels, and basically everything you're fighting can outrun you or chase you down. Flying the F-5A out in missions, I found myself very frequently stuck inside of a two-circle flow, but against 3 or 4 people at once, instead of just one-on-one. So what ends up happening is that you're constantly stuck trying to jank, use flares, and turn in on a target, only to get a 1 or 2 second window to shoot, because you have to immediately adjust your attitude to avoid the 2 other guys who just got a lead in on you. Since you're too slow, the other players literally just end up flying figure 8s on you because you can't outrun them or chase them. So they have the freedom to break out and fly away for a minute while you're trying to deal with the other 3 people you're fighting, and then they turn around for a straight-on pass instead of a turning pass. You might be thinking, well, Tim, you just suck. And you're right, I'm basically the worst pilot ever and all of that, but I found this same type of pattern happening in the majority of missions where I got into a furball. Most of my success with the F-5A was fighting on the edges where it's a little bit easier to get one-on-one, or at worst, 2-on-1 fights going. Furthermore, because of your low speed, you're going to spend a lot of time doing turn and burn fights. And since the AIM-9E is, again, a pretty bad dogfight missile, most of your kills are probably going to be with guns. And that's okay. Just be aware of it going into things. Over the course of putting the F-5A through its paces, I got roughly twice as many gun kills as I did missile kills. And most of the missile kills I got were when I was down-tiered against jets with similar speeds as the F-5A. I'm not saying the F-5A is a bad plane. It's not. But the current matchmaking and BR setup forces you into a very narrow playstyle if you want to be successful in air combat, and it's important to realize that before you're taking this out into a mission. Since this is an event vehicle, I don't think it's as much of a problem as it might be. You can get the F-5A almost for free if you grind it out during the event, and if this is your first jet, it'll be a great introduction to jet tiers. I really think that a lot of people might find the F-5A basically to be like a trainer to help them practice jet dogfighting if they're not familiar with it. In that role, I think this plane will be a success. It just won't be a big RP grinder or anything like that. And speaking of grinding, every time you get shot down in the F-5A, 16,817 silver lines are flushed down the toilet. So don't expect a lot of income here. Visually, the F-5A is a nice looking plane. The default skin is of the prototype paint job, and you can unlock a few in-service paint jobs with Golden Eagles. I kind of like the idea of, like, desperately taking out a prototype plane, to, like, defend your airfield or something like that, so I stuck with the prototype skin. The cockpit is also pretty decent, even if it's really basic. Visibility is great, but you don't have any kind of heads-up display, just that static gun sight. And you don't have any radar or anything, so no radar scope. Good, but basic. To close up on the F-5A, the plane has weapon loadouts very well suited to close air support, and you can get it as an event reward without having to research up the American tech tree. It also maneuvers well once you get the hang of it and can deploy combat flaps at pretty high speeds. However, its low top-end speed is a serious liability and you hit a brick wall at Mach 1.01. Its air-to-air weapons are not good, it doesn't have any radar, and it's incredibly expensive to repair. The final verdict on the F-5A is that it's better as an event reward than it would be in the tech tree, but its expensive repair cost is still a serious problem. It isn't bad, but just know what you're getting into if you choose this over the German tank as your event prize. As always, thanks for watching.